In this video, which I recorded on the 30th of January, the anniversary of the execution of King Charles I, I want to talk about the King's trial and the circumstances of his death. But before we get to that, I want to speak briefly of the end of the English Civil War and the immediate events leading up to his trial. The First English Civil War concluded in the spring and early summer of 1646. The end began in April when King Charles I fled his besieged base at Oxford dressed as a servant and headed north. And on the 5th of May he surrendered himself to the Scottish army, which was then camped at Southwell in Nottinghamshire. The Scots took Charles north to Newcastle, but 9 months later, in January 1647, having been given £100,000 by the English Parliament and with promises of more money to come, they brought Charles south to Holmby House in Northamptonshire, and they handed him over to the forces of the Long Parliament. There he remained until June of 1647, when a cornet in the New Model Army, working on his own initiative, a man called George Joyce, seized the king and took him to Newmarket. At this point in 1647, there were growing tensions between Parliament and the New Model Army. These were primarily over religious matters. Members of Parliament were mostly of a Presbyterian religious outlook, and the New Model Army was mostly manned with independent Congregationalists. The Puritans were by no means a united force. They were all united, of course, by one thing, by their hatred of Charles I. For a time, the king was moved around. He was first moved to the Palace of Oatlands, one of the homes of his youth, and finally to Hampton Court Palace. And during this time, he was kept under a sort of loose house arrest. That enabled the king in November of 1647 to escape Hampton Court Palace and make his way to Southampton. There he began to open communications with Colonel Robert Hammond, who was the parliamentary governor of the Isle of Wight, who he had been led to believe would be sympathetic to his cause. He had been deceived, and when the king landed on the Isle of Wight, he was immediately arrested by Hammond and incarcerated in the governor's residence, Carisbrooke Castle, and there he would remain for the whole next year as a second phase of the English Civil War began and then ended. During 1648, the king did try to escape twice, but both attempts were thwarted. On the 20th of March 1648, the king tried to climb out of this window and then lower himself down from his chamber to the castle courtyard. However, he became stuck fast between an iron bar and the window frame, and he couldn't get out. A second plan in April involved smuggling in a hacksaw and nitric acid to dissolve the bar, and the plan was put into action by the king on the 29th, having bribed his sentries. However, the sentries gave him away to Colonel Hammond, who walked into the king's chamber while the king was busy cutting away at the bar with his hacksaw. Rather amusingly, Hammond offered to take his leave of the king, as he had heard he was going away, and the king simply laughed. The king never managed to escape. In that second phase of the war, the Royalists were roundly defeated by the New Model Army within a year. Cromwell and his associates were less inclined to negotiate with the incarcerated and powerless king. On the 6th of December 1648, a military coup occurred in London. New Model Army commander Thomas Pride entered the House of Commons and, in an action known as Pride's Purge, cleared the Commons of any members that were not supportive of the New Model Army. What was left of the Long Parliament became the Rump Parliament, controlled by the army. On the same day as Pride's Purge, the king was placed in the custody of the New Model Army, and his fate was sealed. In January of 1649, despite the protests of the House of Lords and the Chief Justices of England's highest courts, the Rump House of Commons decided they would legislate to execute Charles I. Despite the protest of these other authorities, they proceeded to try the king for high treason in a specially convened High Court of Justice. Originally, it was intended that this High Court was to include 3 judges and 150 commissioners taken from members of both the House of Lords and the House of Commons. However, following the protests of the justices and the lords, they were excluded, and the 138 commissioners that sat in judgment on the king were drawn primarily from the Commons. The king was brought from the Isle of Wight to London and then to Whitehall Palace on the 19th of January 1649 under strict guard, and the trial opened on Saturday the 20th of January. He was accused of being single-handedly responsible for the English Civil War, which the Commons argued was an act of treason against the people. The trial took place in Westminster Hall, and in a very visible reversal of power that must have been quite striking to those who saw it at the time, the commissioners, with their president John Bradshaw, were arranged on the dais of the hall. The dais of Westminster Hall included a seat that had hitherto only ever been occupied by a king, and 23 years earlier Charles had sat in that seat to dine at his coronation banquet. But during his trial, Charles was placed on the floor of the hall, right below the dais, where he sat in a makeshift dock. Charles appeared at his trial dressed in his usual daily attire, adorned with symbols of his sovereignty of the Order of the Garter. He wore entirely black garments and a broad-brimmed hat, with his cloak embroidered with a large garter star, and around his neck on a blue ribbon was a jewelled Lesser George. Charles was prepared for a fight, and when John Cook, the Solicitor General who was prosecuting him, stood up to talk, he was abruptly told by the king to hold, and when he refused to do so, received a sharp rap on the shoulder from the king's cane. When Cook continued, the king rapped him a second time, and when that didn't silence him, the king rapped him so hard on the shoulder a third time that the silver end of his cane dropped off, which he had to stoop down to the floor to retrieve himself. Charles resolutely refused to accept the legitimacy of the court and its authority. In truth, the Commons were seizing power, for up to this point the authority of any court came from the Crown. By virtue of his office as sovereign, Charles argued that he was above the law, that he was the law, and had complete immunity from prosecution. He was quite correct. Even to the present day, the British sovereign is immune from prosecution in court. As he rejected the authority of the court, Charles refused to enter a plea. After the first day of the trial, which was something of a standoff between Cook and the king, the trial was then adjourned until Monday the 22nd. And on the 22nd, Bradshaw and the commissioners, despite the king's continuing lack of plea, carried on with the trial nonetheless on the basis that a refusal to plea indicated the king's guilt. The king continued with his interruptions to the proceedings and refused to recognise the court or answer any charges. After the 23rd of January, somewhat exasperated at this stage, the commissioners banned the king from speaking further until he decided he would answer the charges directly. On the 24th, the commissioners, not wanting any further interruptions, withdrew to the Painted Chamber, the medieval Great Chamber of English kings, to hear further evidence without the king being present. They quickly concluded among themselves that there was quite enough evidence to order Charles's immediate execution, and they gathered again on the 26th of January simply to agree the wording of the king's death warrant. The court reassembled in Westminster Hall on Saturday the 27th with the king present in the dock. There were some interruptions from the gallery, and there were even objections from one of the commissioners, but after briefly considering these objections, the commissioners returned and Bradshaw began summing up the court's case. This was but a mere formality. The decision had been made to kill the king at the very outset of the trial. Charles I was condemned to death as a traitor and tyrant, Bradshaw declaring, "This court, being satisfied that Charles Stuart was guilty of the crimes of which he had been accused, did judge him tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of the nation, and that he is to be put to death by the severing of his head from his body." The 67 commissioners then present all stood as Bradshaw passed this sentence, and 59 would remain to sign the king's death warrant. Unintimidated by this, King Charles tried to rise to his feet and attempt to address the court, but was prevented from doing so, and he was taken immediately to St James's Palace, where he spent his last remaining days. On the 30th of January 1649, King Charles I rose from his bed at 5 a.m. to prepare for his final hours. It was a cold, crisp day, and he dressed warmly, putting on an extra shirt so that the crowd at his execution would not see him shiver and think he was quivering with fear. He then dressed in his usual black attire with his garter sash, which he wore without the Lesser George, which he had given the day before to his son Henry, Duke of Gloucester. The king walked on foot under heavy guard the short distance from St James's to Whitehall, the palace that had been the primary seat of his court, and he was led through to the Banqueting House constructed by Inigo Jones for his father. As he passed through this great space, he must have gazed up at the great ceiling that he had commissioned from Peter Paul Rubens. Its imagery was a colourful celebration of the divine right of kings to rule, of the success of his father in peacefully uniting the crowns of England and Scotland. The painting portrayed his father, James I, being lifted into heaven by a figure of justice and exchanging his imperial crown with a heavenly crown of laurel. The Banqueting House was chosen as the location for the execution precisely because it was a central part of the king's former life, and it was also a public-facing space. A road that's now called Whitehall ran through the middle of the palace, dividing it in half, and the Banqueting House, as it does today, faced directly onto that road. And at this point the road was a wide concourse where a crowd could gather, but it was one that was easily controllable, as there was a gate at the eastern end of it, and if there was a riot, such a riot could be readily brought to order. There is no question that Charles I faced his death with great courage. A public scaffold had been erected at first floor level, facing out towards the road, and the king was brought up to the gallery of the Banqueting House at this level, and it was out of a first floor window of the bright and colourful Banqueting House that the king stepped onto the black draped scaffold on the afternoon of the 30th of January 1649 to meet his fate. A large crowd had assembled, and it was the king's intention to address them, but they were kept too far back from the scaffold by the nervous soldiers for anyone to hear his words. And well aware of this, the king addressed the speech to his former chaplain William Juxon, lately Bishop of London, who accompanied him to the scaffold. Juxon recorded the speech in some detail, and it was bold. The king declared his innocence of any fault in the Civil War. He argued that he had never made war on Parliament, nor intended to step on their privileges. He allegedly said that he hoped God would absolve Parliament of the guilt in his death, and that it was his hope that his death would not result in God punishing the English people. He declared his desire to see his people free, but made his view plain that the job of government was the prerogative of the sovereign, and not of the subject, not of the people. He ended his speech by remarking to the assembled company that he would die a martyr of the people. It was a tenacious speech, but at this point Charles had nothing to lose. He then asked Dr. Juxon to give him his nightcap so he could tie up his long hair and keep it away from his neck for the benefit of the executioner. And his last words to Juxon were words of faith, and there is no doubt that Charles was a man of personal Christian faith. "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be, no disturbance of the world," he said. How those words seem to echo the image of his father on the Banqueting House ceiling. He agreed with the headsman that when he stretched his hands out before him, that would be the sign for him to strike the fatal blow, and so he lay his head on the block, the executioner pushing up his straggling hair into the nightcap. He stretched forth his hands, and with one blow of the axe, his head was severed. The executioner, having performed his grisly task, raised the king's head for all to see, and then the king's remains were placed in a prepared black velvet covered coffin. The king's corpse was then taken into the palace, where it faced the indignity of public display for several days. Lord Clarendon, writing later, said that this was done so that all men might know that he was not alive. One of those who went in to see the king's body was Sir Purbeck Temple, who said the king's head was smiling as perfectly as if he had been alive. After a few days, the king's body was then removed to St James's Palace, where it was embalmed, the work being conducted by Thomas Trapham, Surgeon General to the New Model Army. There are differing accounts as to whether the king's head was reattached to his body or not, but more on that in the next video. There was considerable debate as to where the king might be buried. Parliament decided that to bury him in Westminster Abbey with his parents and ancestors was quite impossible. It was far too close to the public gaze. And on the 7th of February, his body was taken to Windsor for discreet burial in St George's Chapel, and that is the subject of my next video. Charles I is a figure who is difficult to assess, and there is little nuance in people's general assessment of him. He is either a saint or a sinner. To some, Charles I will be forever, as he was to many Puritans in his lifetime, Charles Stuart, that man of blood. To others, his death of an anointed sovereign, made him a martyr. Ultimately, his death did the new Republican regime no favours. The creation of the Rump and the death of the king left a power vacuum that was difficult to fill, even by Oliver Cromwell. And of course, a little over 11 years after Charles's execution, his son would return to the throne as King Charles II. Those who viewed King Charles I as a martyr were keen to preserve personal relics of the king. One or two can be connected to the events of that bitterly cold day in January of 1649. The most poignant, I feel, is in the collection of the Museum of London. It is the king's undershirt that he wore at his execution, the one he put on so that he wouldn't shiver and show fear. Light blue, perhaps to match his garter sash, it is made of a delicately knitted silk. It is a very beautiful object, but it bears on it the scars of that day in 1649, for on its front it is badly stained. Whether these stains are the blood of the king or vomit has been difficult to determine, but they are a rather vivid witness to the day that England publicly executed its king. Thanks for watching.